not walking our daughter down the aisle next to that man." Margaret Okafor's voice was quiet. That was always the warning sign. Not the raised voice, not the slammed doors. The quiet. Her daughter Claire stood in the kitchen doorway, still holding her car keys. She'd driven 3 hours from Columbus to tell her parents in person. She thought that mattered. She thought it would help. It didn't. "Mom." Claire set her keys on the counter, slowly, deliberately. "His name is Marcus Webb. He has a name." "I know his name." Margaret turned back to the stove. "I know everything about him. I know he grew up in Section 8 housing in Dayton. I know his mother cleaned offices for a living. I know he has student loans that won't be paid off until he's 50. And I know that you have a medical degree and a future at this hospital that you are about to complicate with a choice you haven't thought through. I've thought through nothing else for 2 years." "Then think harder." Margaret turned. Her eyes were not unkind. That was the worst part. She genuinely believed what she was saying. "Claire, we did not sacrifice everything we sacrificed so you could settle." Claire looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, very calmly, "He doesn't make me feel like I'm settling, Mom. He makes me feel like I finally arrived somewhere." She picked up her keys. She drove back to Columbus that same night without eating dinner. That conversation was the last time Claire and her mother spoke without lawyers present. What happened in the 14 months that followed would dismantle everything Margaret Okafor believed about success, about class, and about the man she'd called beneath her daughter. And when you find out what he did for Claire during the worst year of her life, you will not look at the word enough the same way again. To understand why Margaret said what she said, you have to understand where she came from. Margaret was born Maggie Reeves in a 2-bedroom apartment in Baltimore, the third of 5 children. Her father stocked shelves at a grocery store. Her mother braided hair out of their kitchen on weekends to make rent. There was love in that apartment. There was also never, not once, enough money. Maggie watched her parents fight about the electric bill so many times she memorized the script. She watched her older brother drop out of community college to work full-time because the family needed the income more than it needed another degree. She watched her mother's hands, always moving, always working, develop arthritis by age 50 that the family couldn't afford to treat properly. At 14, sitting at a kitchen table doing homework by lamplight because the overhead bulb had blown and the replacement cost $3 they didn't have, Maggie Reeves made a promise to herself. She would get out. She would get so far out that her children would never know what it felt like to count dollars on the way to the checkout line. She meant it. She worked for it. She got a full scholarship to the University of Maryland, then an MBA from Georgetown. She met Douglas Okafor at a conference in 1988. He was a structural engineer, Nigerian American, first generation, equally determined, equally determined, equally determined. They recognized each other immediately. 2 people who had clawed their way to the table and refused to let anyone pull them back. They built a life in Silver Spring, a good one. Douglas's engineering firm grew. Margaret became CFO of a regional healthcare company. They sent their only daughter Claire to the best private schools, then Johns Hopkins, then Ohio State for her residency. They gave her everything they had never had. And somewhere in all that giving, Margaret forgot something important. She forgot what it felt like to be judged for where you came from rather than who you were. Because now she was doing it to someone else. Claire Okafor was 34 years old, a second year attending an emergency medicine at Columbus General, and the most competent person in almost any room she walked into. She had her mother's precision and her father's steadiness. She made decisions under pressure that most people couldn't make with a week to think about them. She saved lives on Tuesdays like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. And she was lonely in a way that her career had never touched. Not lonely, like sad. Lonely like a house with all the lights on and no one home. She dated the men her mother approved of. An orthopedic surgeon in Baltimore who talked about his investment portfolio at dinner. A corporate attorney in D.C. who texted during movies and called it multitasking. A Johns Hopkins classmate her mother had practically arranged like a business merger. They were all accomplished. They were all fine. Not one of them had ever once asked Claire what scared her. She met Marcus Webb at a volunteer shift. Columbus General partnered twice a year with a free clinic on the east side of the city. Most of the attending physicians rotated through once, checked the box, went back to their regular schedules. Claire had been going every month for 2 years because she couldn't stop thinking about the patients she saw there. People who came in with infections that had gone too long because they couldn't afford urgent care. Mothers who brought their kids in for earaches that had been hurting for 3 weeks because the copay wasn't in the budget. Marcus ran the clinic, not as a doctor. As an operations coordinator, he'd built the scheduling system, negotiated the supply donations, recruited the volunteer physicians, and somehow kept the whole thing running on a budget that most hospitals spent on printer ink. The first time Claire met him, he was on the phone with a pharmaceutical rep, not asking for a donation, explaining, with the patience of someone who has had this conversation many times, exactly which medications they needed, and precisely why the rep's company's charitable offer of medications expiring in 6 weeks was not actually charitable. He hung up, turned to Claire, and said, "Dr. Okafor, I'm Marcus. The exam rooms are ready. Mrs. Patterson in room 2 has been waiting longest. Fair warning, she's going to tell you about her cat before she tells you about her knee." Claire smiled. "What's the cat's name?" "Gerald. He apparently has opinions." She was in room 2 before she realized she was already looking forward to the end of the shift so she could talk to him again. Marcus Webb was 37 years old and had grown up in Dayton in a way that left marks. His mother, a woman named Teresa, had cleaned office buildings on the night shift for 19 years. His father had left when Marcus was 9. Not dramatically. He just stopped coming home one day, the way some men do, as if fatherhood were a job they'd decided was no longer worth the commute. Teresa raised Marcus and his younger sister alone. She made it work the way single mothers always make it work, by working more than one person should have to work, by sleeping less than was good for her, by making sure the kids never felt the weight of what she was carrying. Marcus knew anyway. Kids always know. He paid attention to money the way you do when you've watched your mother stare at bills. He understood the distance between what things cost and what people could pay. When he went to Ohio State on a Pell Grant and a partial scholarship and 3 part-time jobs, he studied public health because he wanted to build systems that closed that distance. After graduation, he found the East Side Clinic and never left. He made $48,000 a year. He drove a 2014 Civic with a crack in the dashboard he'd meant to fix for 3 years. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Franklinton and split the rent with his sister until she'd saved enough to get her own place. He cooked his own meals, tracked his budget in a notebook, and spent his evenings and weekends doing exactly what he'd done during the week because the work was never finished and he didn't mind. He was the most present person Claire had ever met. Not present in a performance way. Present like a person who had decided, somewhere along the line, that the thing in front of him was worth his full attention. When she talked, he listened without checking his phone. When a patient was difficult, he slowed down instead of speeding up. When something was broken at the clinic, he fixed it himself if he could, or found someone who could if he couldn't. He was not flashy. He did not take up a room. He just quietly made everything around him work better. Claire fell in love with him the way you fall asleep, gradually and then all at once. They dated for 8 months before she told her parents. She already knew what her mother would say. She told her father first, on the phone, and Douglas listened carefully and asked 2 questions. Is he kind to you? And does he have integrity? Claire said yes to both. Douglas said, then I'd like to meet him. Simple as that. Margaret was a different conversation. Margaret asked how much he made. Margaret asked where he'd gone to school. Margaret asked whether Claire understood that the financial dynamics of a marriage like this would fall unevenly on her. Margaret said, not unkindly, I grew up with nothing, Claire. I know what it looks like, and I know what it costs. It costs less than being alone, Claire said. Margaret didn't say anything to that. The dinner where Claire brought Marcus to Silver Spring lasted 45 minutes. Margaret was polite the way a locked door is polite, formally closed. Douglas tried. Marcus tried harder. He was thoughtful and direct and clearly nervous in the way that people are nervous when they care about making a good impression. He talked about the clinic. He asked Douglas about engineering. He helped clear the table without being asked. Margaret said very little. On the drive home, Claire stared at the highway and Marcus held her hand and didn't push. She was grateful for that more than she could say. She proposed to him 3 months later. He said yes before she finished the sentence. When Claire called her mother to tell her they were engaged, Margaret said, "I hope you know what you're doing." Then she said she needed to go and hung up. She sent a card, a nice one, with flowers on it, but she didn't call back. The consequences came quickly, not financial, not professional. Personal. The quiet kind that no one outside the family could see. Margaret told her sister that Claire was making a mistake. The sister told her husband. The husband mentioned it at a family gathering. And suddenly the thing that should have been Claire's happiest announcement was something that required explanation and defense at every holiday table. Claire's cousin sent her a text that said, "Your mom's just scared. She'll come around." Her aunt called and said, essentially, the same thing. Everyone kept assuring Claire that Margaret would come around, as if what Margaret was doing was a mood rather than a choice. Marcus watched all of this. He didn't say much about it. But one evening he sat across from Claire at the kitchen table in her apartment and said, "I need you to know something. If this is too much, if the cost of choosing me is more than you're willing to pay, I will understand. I will be devastated, but I will understand." Claire looked at him. "Are you giving me an out?" "I'm giving you a choice. There's a difference." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "My choice is you. It's been you since Gerald the cat." He laughed. Then his eyes were wet. He blinked it away. They got married on a Saturday in October. A small ceremony at a botanical garden in Columbus. 30 people. Her father stood beside her, his arm linked through hers, eyes red from the moment they stepped outside. Margaret sat in the front row in a beautiful dress she had bought for the occasion, because Margaret O'Coffer was always composed in public. She smiled at the right moments. She cried a little during the vows. But she left during the reception before the cake was cut. Claire saw her go. She didn't go after her. The first year of their marriage was good. Genuinely, quietly good in the way that life becomes when you stop performing and start actually living it. Marcus cooked on the nights Claire worked late, which was most nights. Not elaborate meals, practical ones. He learned her schedule and worked around it without being asked. He tracked their shared finances in a spreadsheet he built from scratch, splitting costs fairly, building an emergency fund from the first month, explaining everything clearly because he'd grown up knowing that financial confusion was how people got hurt. Claire, who had gone through medical school and residency on a combination of grants, loans, and sheer endurance, understood money in the abstract but had never quite built the habits. Her first year of attending salary had mostly gone to catching up on loans and not thinking too hard about the rest. Marcus sat with her and built a system, not lecturing, not taking over. Teaching. The way you teach someone when you respect them. "This column is fixed," he said, pointing at the screen. "Mortgage, utilities, your loan payment. This one's variable. This one's the most important." He pointed to a line in blue. "That's what we pay ourselves first. Before anything else goes out, this goes in. Even if it's not much, especially when it's not much." Claire looked at the spreadsheet. "You built this yourself?" "I built it in 2014 when I had $200 left after bills and I needed to understand why." He paused. "I was scared. I didn't want to be scared again without a system." She understood that. She understood it deeply. What she hadn't expected was how much Marcus would teach her about being present. Doctors learn to compartmentalize. It's survival. You cannot carry every patient home with you, or you will collapse before the end of your first year. But somewhere in learning to put the job in a box at the end of the shift, Claire had also learned to put herself in a box. Her feelings, her fears, her grief. Things got placed carefully in the appropriate container and labeled later. Marcus did not operate like this. When something bothered him, he said so, not explosively, not as an accusation, just directly, as if emotions were facts worth stating. When he was worried about his mother, he said he was worried. When he had a hard day at the clinic, he said it was hard. When he had a hard day at the clinic, he said it was hard. When Claire came home at 2 a.m., After losing a patient and sat down on the kitchen floor because she couldn't make it to the couch, he sat down on the floor next to her and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Do you want to talk or do you want company?" "Company," she said. He stayed on the floor. 8 months into their marriage, Teresa Webb had a stroke. It was a Tuesday morning. Marcus got the call from his sister at 7 a.m. He drove to Dayton while Claire was already at the hospital. By the time she knew, he was already in the ICU waiting room. She rearranged 3 shifts, called in a favor with a colleague, and drove to Dayton that afternoon. Teresa survived. Partially. The stroke left her with weakness on her left side and speech that came slowly, halting and rearranged, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. She would need rehabilitation. She would need monitoring. She would likely need assistance eventually, long term. Marcus didn't talk about what this meant financially in front of his mother. He waited until they were in the hospital parking garage, standing between 2 cars in the half-dark, and then he said it. "I don't know how we're going to pay for the rehab facility. Her insurance has a cap. I've been looking at the numbers, and I don't see how we do this without." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I just needed to say it out loud." Claire pulled out her phone. She opened the spreadsheet he'd built. She looked at the emergency fund column. "We have 11,000 saved," she said. "I know. That covers about 5 months at a mid-tier facility." "I know. And my next attending review is in 3 months. If I take the department lead position they've been offering me, the salary increase is significant." Marcus looked at her. "You've been turning that down for a year. Because the hours were brutal and we were still finding our rhythm." She put the phone away. "Now we have a reason to revisit it." He was quiet. "That's your career. I don't want you to." "Marcus." She said it simply, the way he said things simply. "You sat on my kitchen floor at 2 a.m. so I wouldn't be alone. We're not keeping score here." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and pressed his forehead against the concrete pillar beside him and breathed. She put her hand on his back. That was all. What happened next is the part that doesn't get told enough in stories about financial hardship, because it's not dramatic. It's slow. It's just 2 people making decisions over and over again in small, unsexy ways. Claire took the department lead position. She worked more hours. Some weeks, she barely saw Marcus. He took on grant writing for the clinic after hours to bring in more funding, which didn't pay him directly, but secured the clinic's future and kept his work meaningful. Teresa did her rehabilitation with the dogged stubbornness of a woman who had been underestimated her whole life. By month 4, she could hold a pen. By month 6, she could walk without the cane most days. Marcus was at every session he could get to. He drove the 40 minutes to Dayton and back twice a week, brought his laptop, worked from the waiting room. When Claire could come, she came. When she couldn't, she called Teresa directly. Teresa, whose words still came slowly, had taken to calling Claire my daughter. Claire, whose own mother still called on a schedule that felt like a corporate check-in, said the word back to her without hesitation. Here is something that doesn't appear on a balance sheet. When the person you married shows up for your family the same way they show up for everything, without being asked, without keeping score, without performing goodness because someone is watching, it changes something in you. It recalibrates what you thought you were looking for. Claire had spent her whole life in rooms where people talked about what they'd accomplished, who they trained under, who they published with, what their salary was, where they vacationed. She was good at those conversations. She built herself into someone who was good at those conversations. Marcus didn't have those conversations, not because he wasn't impressive, because he was more interested in the person in front of him than in his own resume. At some point in that difficult year, Claire stopped thinking about what her mother had said about him. She stopped measuring him against it. She stopped defending him even to herself. She just watched him live. And the watching was enough. Margaret Okafor did not come around the way everyone had promised she would. She came around differently. Slower, through the back door instead of the front. It started with a phone call from Douglas. He'd driven to Dayton on his own one weekend, just to visit Teresa at the rehab facility. He hadn't told Claire. He hadn't told Margaret. He'd just gone. He called Claire afterward and said, "She showed me pictures of Marcus when he was a boy. She has this one of him at 7 years old, dressed up as a doctor for Halloween." A pause. "She is very proud of him, Claire." "I know," Claire said. "Your mother should know this woman." Claire didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you what to do," Douglas said. "I'm telling you what I saw. And what I saw was a woman who raised a man who drives 40 minutes twice a week to sit with her while she relearns how to walk. That is not nothing. That is everything." 3 weeks later, Margaret called. Not Claire. She called Marcus. Claire found out later, from Marcus, who told her the same evening. He'd been in the clinic parking lot heading to his car when his phone rang and he didn't recognize the number. When he heard Margaret's voice, he sat back down on the curb. She hadn't apologized. Not at first. She'd asked him questions. How was the clinic? How was Teresa? How was the grant writing going? The questions of a woman who had done her research, who knew the details, who was trying to build a bridge one plank at a time. And then at the end, she had said, "I owe you an apology, Marcus." He'd been quiet. "I measured you against the wrong things," she said. "I was so afraid of my daughter struggling that I turned that fear into a verdict. And I was wrong." A pause. "I was wrong about what struggle looks like. And I was wrong about what struggle looks like. And I was wrong about what strength looks like." Marcus, sitting on a curb in a parking lot, said, "Mrs. Okafor, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you work so hard your whole life?" She didn't answer immediately. "Because I didn't want my children to carry what I carried." "That's why I work hard too," he said. "Different starting point, same reason." The silence lasted long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then Margaret said, "Would you and Claire come to dinner on Sunday?" He said yes before he thought to ask if Claire was free. She was. The dinner in Silver Spring was not a reconciliation scene from a movie. There was no dramatic speech. Margaret did not cry at the table. Douglas made his jollof rice, which was exceptional, and they ate and talked, and the conversation moved around the table in the easy way of people who are trying, all of them, to do better. At one point, Margaret asked Marcus about the grant he was writing for the clinic. He explained it, in detail. The gap in pediatric preventive care on the East Side. The data on outcomes when children missed early screenings. The cost-benefit analysis he'd built, which showed that every dollar spent on prevention saved $12 in emergency care down the line. Margaret listened. She listened the way she listened in financial meetings, carefully, analytically. And then she said, "Have you approached any private foundations? There are 2 in Ohio. I have relationships with that focus on community health infrastructure." Marcus looked at her. "I haven't." "Send me your proposal draft," she said. "I'll make some calls." He sent it Monday morning. She called back by Thursday. By the end of the month, the clinic had a meeting scheduled with one of the foundations. By the end of the quarter, they had a 2-year grant commitment. Not enormous, but significant. Enough to hire a part-time outreach coordinator and expand Saturday hours. Marcus called Margaret to tell her. She said, "Don't thank me, just keep doing what you're doing." He thanked her anyway. Margaret Okafor had built her career on identifying value. She prided herself on it. She could look at a balance sheet and find what was real and what was inflated. She could walk into a room and assess, within minutes, who had substance and who had style. She had looked at Marcus Webb and seen a credit score and a salary. She had not seen what was underneath. That was the mistake she had to live with, and to her credit, she lived with it honestly. 2 years after the wedding, on a Sunday afternoon in late October, 5 people sat around the dining room table in Silver Spring. Douglas had made too much food, as always. The jollof rice, the plantains, a roast that had been in the oven since morning. Teresa Webb sat at the table with her left hand in her lap, her right hand steady around her fork. She talked slowly, but she talked. She had, over the past year, developed a specific and lively correspondence with Douglas about structural engineering, a subject about which she knew nothing but was deeply curious, and a subject about which Douglas knew everything and would discuss indefinitely. Margaret sat across from Marcus. She was asking him about the new outreach coordinator at the clinic, what her background was, whether she'd worked in public health before. Marcus answered in detail, the way he answered every question, as if the person asking deserved his full attention. Claire watched from her end of the table. She had taken a shift trade and gotten the whole weekend off, something that almost never happened. The room was warm. The windows were fogged from the cooking. Someone had put music on low, an old Stevie Wonder album that Douglas loved. Her phone was in her purse, not on the table. She thought about her mother sitting across from this man she had spent a year dismissing, asking him careful questions with genuine interest, like she was getting to know him. Because she was getting to know him. Because she had finally decided that what she thought she knew was less important than what was actually true. She thought about Marcus driving to Dayton in the dark on Tuesday morning so his mother wouldn't do physical therapy alone. She thought about the kitchen floor. She thought about a clipboard in a clinic, a phone call about an expiring pharmaceutical donation, and a 2014 Civic with a cracked dashboard that she now drove half the time because hers was in the shop. She thought about what her mother had said, so long ago it felt like another life. We did not sacrifice everything so you could settle. She hadn't settled. She had, against all predictions, arrived. Douglas raised his glass. He did this sometimes, for no occasion, just because he felt like it. To the table, he said. His toast always. They raised their glasses. Teresa raised hers slowly, carefully, and held it steady. To the table, they said. And the room was full. There will always be people who look at a life and measure it by what it costs. By the square footage. By the title. By the number after the dollar sign. And sometimes those people love you. Sometimes those people are your own mother, sitting across a table from you, trying to protect you from a version of struggle she has never been able to forget. But here is the thing about measuring love against a balance sheet. A balance sheet can only tell you what something is worth today. It cannot tell you what it will be worth tomorrow or what it has already paid for in quiet ways. No ledger captures. Marcus Webb did not have what Margaret Okafor was looking for. He had something harder to find and harder to name. He had the kind of presence that doesn't ask for credit. The kind of love that shows up on a Tuesday. The kind of character that gets tested not in the big moments, but in the small, invisible ones. The parking garage. The hospital floor. The 40-minute drive. The curb in the clinic parking lot where he sat down to take a hard call with dignity. And Claire Okafor, who had saved lives and measured vitals and made decisions in crisis with her hands completely steady, had recognized it. She had chosen wisely. She had chosen well. I keep thinking about Margaret standing in her own kitchen, a woman who had built something real from nothing, telling her daughter that the man she loved wasn't enough. And I think about how Margaret wasn't wrong about struggle. She knew exactly what struggle looked like. She'd lived inside it for decades. What she got wrong was thinking she could see it in Marcus, and that seeing it meant she understood his worth. That's the thing about fear. It disguises itself as wisdom. It puts on a suit and calls itself experience. And sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones most capable of delivering it with a straight face. Marcus didn't fight Margaret's judgment. He didn't try to prove her wrong by arguing. He just kept showing up. To the clinic at 7 a.m., to Dayton on Tuesday mornings, to the kitchen floor at 2 a.m. when Claire came home wrecked from a shift and couldn't find words for what she was carrying. That consistency, that refusal to shrink or perform or campaign for approval, that's not a personality trait. That's a choice made over and over again, quietly, without an audience. I think about how easy it would have been for him to become bitter. His mother had worked herself into a stroke cleaning buildings that belonged to other people. He built something meaningful on a salary that a lot of people would call insufficient. He had every reason to be hard. He wasn't. That's not luck. That's character that got built the hard way. Through decades of watching someone you love do the impossible without complaint, and deciding that you're going to honor that by doing the same. What changed? Margaret wasn't a conversation. It wasn't an apology or an argument. It was evidence. It was Douglas walking into a rehab facility in Dayton and watching a man sit with his mother while she relearned how to hold a pen. It was realizing that what she dismissed as insufficient was actually a kind of strength she hadn't seen in a boardroom or a balance sheet, because it doesn't show up there. I grew up hearing that you become what you practice. Not what you intend, not what you believe about yourself, but what you actually do when nobody's watching and nothing's required. Marcus practiced showing up. He practiced honesty about fear. He practiced asking, "Do you want to talk or do you want company?" instead of filling silence with noise. He practiced the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself, that just quietly solves the problem in front of it and moves to the next one. And Claire practiced something too. She practiced choosing what she actually knew over what she was told to believe. That takes more courage than people give it credit for. When the person telling you what to do loves you, when they're not wrong about everything, when they have a history that earns them the right to an opinion. Saying, "I see it differently," is genuinely hard. She did it anyway, not loudly, just steadily. I wrote this story because I wanted to ask something I think about a lot. What do we actually mean when we say someone is enough? Enough for what? Enough by whose measure? Because the measures we inherit aren't always the ones that serve us. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is sit down with the inherited measure and decide, calmly and without anger, that it doesn't apply here. Margaret got there, late through the back door, one careful question at a time. That matters too. It's not just the people who are right from the beginning who deserve credit. Sometimes the hardest kind of integrity is the kind that admits it was wrong and then proves it through action, one Sunday dinner at a time. "To the table," Douglas said. "That's all." To the table. That's everything.